I wasn't in a good place that spring, and that's me putting it politely for neighbours who still wave from the road and ask how I'm holding up, like there's a useful answer to that question. I was 42, running the same foothill homestead my dad ran before me, and every morning I woke up with the same two thoughts in the same order. Check the U's, and then remember what I'd said to my boy the day he left for Spokane. The first thought kept things alive. The second one kept me from sleeping much in the first place. My wife, Lena, had been gone 2 lambing seasons by then, and grief had settled into my life like old dust in rafters. Always there, mostly quiet, coating everything if you let your hand rest too long. The place itself was honest country. Rolling pasture cut with basalt outcrop, lodgepole pockets up the ridge, one creek that behaved itself most years and then turned mean in late thaw. The house sat low and practical, patched where it needed patching, paint fading where sun and wind took turns sanding it down. I'd inherited all of it, the good and the stubborn. I still used Dad's steel post driver, still hung halters on nails he set, still kept records the way he taught me. Pencil in a pocket notebook. Never trust memory when stock are involved. Fence repair at Westline. 80 feet wire retightened. U47 off-feed monitor. Hayring moved to upper lot. Every task had a line. Every line proved I'd done something measurable with a day that might otherwise slide by in a fog. By the second week of April, I had started checking weather maps the way some folks check a pulse. Around here we called it the April Iron Freeze. That name was older than me and accurate enough to sting. Hard wind from the north, sleet crust over wet ground, night temps low enough to take the heat out of a newborn in minutes, then daytime thaw that turned creek banks to collapse-prone mud. It wasn't dramatic. It was persistent. You didn't beat it once and call yourself done. You managed it hour by hour, moving ewes to lee ground, layering bedding, drying lambs fast, watching for hypothermia, watching for panic, watching for one bad step near the creek edge. The weather didn't hate you. It just didn't care. That was the part that wore on me. I worked in loops because loops were dependable. At dusk, I checked every gate latch by hand, palm pressing cold metal, listening for the click, and then pulling twice to make sure. At midnight, I walked the north pasture with a headlamp and Midge at my heel, sleet needling sideways hard enough to rattle my hood. At 2, I was in the mudroom warming replacer in a dented pot, bottle feeding whichever lamb came light and shaky. At 4, I was back in the barn, counting breaths, checking ears for warmth, rubbing down weak ones with old towels near the heat lamps. That mudroom still held Lena's handwriting on feed tags she'd tied to bins years before. Alfalfa pellets, mineral mix, milk powder, cracked corn. Her block letters were neat and slanted a little right at the end of each word, like she wrote fast but never rushed. Sometimes I'd reach for a tag with both hands full and catch myself staring at it too long, standing there with steam on the window and a hungry lamb bumping my knee. A lot of people think grief is crying in church clothes. Maybe sometimes. For me, it was functioning so completely that no one could tell I was gone from my own life. I paid invoices on time. I serviced the tractor. I rotated pasture as best I could around thaw and runoff. I answered calls from the feed store and said, "Yep," in all the right places. Then I sat at the kitchen table at dawn with coffee gone cold and replayed the argument with my son until the light turned from blue to grey. Caleb had wanted to leave early, said Spokane had work that wasn't seasonal and didn't smell like iodine and wet wool. I told him family land wasn't a hobby you stepped away from because winter ran long. He told me I talked like duty was the only language worth speaking. I said something sharp about quitting when things got hard. He said, very calm, "Mom wouldn't have said that." That was the last clean line between us before the truck taillights went down the drive and turned at the county road. I still heard that sentence when I checked water troughs. I heard it over chains rattling in the barn and over the soft coughs ewes make when they settle. I told myself he was fine. He had a paycheck. He had roommates. He had city heat and paved roads and grocery stores open past dark. It didn't matter. The argument ran on a loop because there was no one left in the house to interrupt it. Lena used to interrupt me for a living, near as I can tell now. Not loud, just exact. If I started spiraling into numbers or weather or old grudges, she'd hand me a wrench and ask me to hold the light where she needed it. There's no one to do that with an empty second chair and a dog that mostly communicates with side-eye and patient sighs. Midge was a blue heeler with one white-socked front paw and the work ethic of a foreman. She slept by the mudroom door with one ear cocked for trouble and woke before I did most nights, nails tapping hardwood when labour started in the lower field. She had a way of checking each ewe in turn, quick and businesslike, then circling back to me as if I might forget who needed what. I trusted her more than I trusted forecasts. If she bristled at the tree line, I paid attention. If she nosed a lamb toward heat, I followed. In those months, she was the only creature in the house that made sound on purpose, and I leaned on that more than I would have admitted out loud. There were evenings I caught myself speaking full sentences to her while we stacked straw, then laughing at how serious I sounded asking a dog if this weather had always felt this personal. 3 days before the hardest freeze warning, I called Caleb from the porch because cell service was best there if I leaned against the post by the rain barrel. Wind had that sharp, wet edge that gets under cuffs and finds your wrists no matter what coat you buy. He answered on the second ring, breath a little short, like he was walking stairs. "Hey, Dad, everything okay?" "Yeah, just checking in. You eating enough?" A pause, then a soft exhale I recognized as him deciding whether to keep it light. "I'm fine. You sound tired." "It's lambing. Tired is part of the package." "Can you get somebody to help nights? Even for a week?" I looked at the upper pasture where the sleet had laid a silver skin over the grass. "I've got it handled." "I know you do," he said. "That's not exactly what I asked." I rubbed my thumb over splintered porch rail and watched Midge trot fence line below me. "You settled in okay up there?" "Yeah, mostly. Warehouse is steady. I'm learning bus routes." Another pause. "You could come up after season. Couple days, no agenda." "Maybe," I said, because maybe was all I had that wasn't a lie. We talked another minute about ordinary things, prices and fuel, and whether he still had his heavy coat, then ended polite, careful, like men crossing creek stones that rocked underfoot. After I hung up, I stood there longer than the call lasted, listening to sleet tick against the metal roof, and hating how relieved I felt, just hearing his voice say "Dad" without anger in it. That week, I stopped pretending sleep would come naturally and started napping in 20-minute scraps between checks. The kitchen clock became less a measure of day than a metronome for chores. 7:10 p.m. check lower lot, 9:40 p.m. prep bottles, 12:15 a.m. rotate bedding in pen 3, 3:05 a.m. creek level gauge. I wrote those times down the way I wrote fence notes, not because I needed the paper, but because writing steadied me. The notebook lived in my left chest pocket, pages wrinkled from weather and wool grease. On one page, tucked between mineral inventory and a reminder to grease the manure spreader, I found a line in Lena's hand from years back when she borrowed the book. "Buy more newborn nipples. Dean forgets every year." She'd drawn a little arrow and a smile face that looked mildly annoyed. I sat on an upside-down bucket in the barn aisle with that notebook open on my knee and laughed once, short and sharp, then had to put my head down until the feeling passed. When morning came, it came colourless. Low cloud, no bird noise yet, frost glassing the trough rims where yesterday had been mud. The kind of dawn that made metal sting through gloves and made breath look heavier than smoke. I checked the lambing shed first, counted noses twice, then walked the east fence where wind always tested the staples loose. Midge ranged ahead, then came back, then ranged again, her path tight and efficient. Nothing in that hour suggested mystery. It was just labor, weather, and a man trying to keep one more fragile season from tipping into loss. That was all I believed in then. What I could carry, what I could count, what I could keep warm until daylight held. Near noon, on my next loop, I found two weak twins from Pen 3, no longer shivering in the open swale where I'd left them under a tarp break. They were tucked 15 yards downslope in the lee of a basalt lip, curled on a thick mat of dry cedar boughs that smelled fresh cut. I stood there with a bottle in my hand, scanning fence lines and empty pasture, then muttered, "Good work, Dean. Now the trees are better shepherds than you." I stood there another full minute, bottle cooling in my hand, and looked for the part I'd missed. The cedar was laid with the cut ends all one way, like somebody had gathered an armload and thought through where the wind would slide off the rock. No random drag marks. No busted twigs from panic. Just those twins breathing easier than they had any right to be after a night like that. Midge came up beside me, sniffed once, and sat down without fuss. She didn't circle, didn't warn, didn't do that sharp little bark she used when a stranger crossed the county easement. She only watched the timberline above us with her ears loose and her mouth closed. I crouched, touched the boughs, and felt dry warmth trapped underneath. Fresh cut, too. Not from my pile by the shed. Those branches still held their oil scent, clean and bright in the cold air. I scanned for boot prints and found none I trusted. The thaw had gone to crust, and then back to slick clay in patches, a mess of hoof dents and my own tread from two different checks. I ran the numbers anyway because numbers were what I had. Could I have moved them half asleep and forgotten? No. Could they have drifted downslope on their own? Not wrapped and bedded like that? Could a neighbour have come through at dawn and decided to help without calling first? Possible if that neighbour could step over woven wire without leaving so much as a scuff. I didn't like any of my answers. I fed both lambs where they lay, gave them each half a bottle so they didn't crash from drinking too fast, then carried them one at a time to the lambing shed, tucked inside my coat and complaining in thin little voices that sounded almost indignant. Back at the spot, I stood over the cedar mat again and pulled out my notebook. My pencil point snapped from the cold. I sharpened it with my pocket knife and wrote, "Cedar bedding found east swale. Twins moved approximately 15 yards to lee side basalt, 11:52 a.m. Then I added a second line because I was irritated at myself for hesitating. Source unknown. That afternoon settled into the usual grind, but it felt off-kilter by half a degree, like a gate hung true until you watched it in wind. I fixed a sag in the south run wire, thawed nipples in a coffee mug by the mudroom sink, and hauled 2 loads of straw to Pen 2, where a first-time ewe kept pawing her bedding flat, as if she could dig clear through to June. Every time I crossed the yard, I checked the ridge without meaning to. Every time I checked it, I told myself to knock it off and focus on what still needed doing. By sundown, the sleet turned finer, more like dust than rain, and the whole place went quiet in a way that didn't match weather. Usually there were crows arguing near the cottonwoods, or magpies hopping along fence posts hunting afterbirth scraps, or at least the creek muttering at the lower bend. That evening, I heard my own jacket brushing my sleeves, and not much else. Even the ewes sounded muted, as if the cold had packed the air with wool. I set up my midnight loop early, topped off the ATV fuel, and laid out dry gloves on the stove rail. Inside the house, the quiet felt heavier than outside. Lena's tags on the feed bins caught my eye every time I crossed the mudroom, and I started talking under my breath just to put a human voice in the room. Not about anything important. Need more towels in the barn. Remember to check 47 again. Quit standing here and move. Practical orders, same tone Dad used to give himself when he was too tired to trust his memory. At 10:40, I took coffee to the porch and tried calling Caleb again, thumb numb against the phone screen. It rang out. I left a message that was mostly weather and stock counts, then stopped, swallowed and said, "No emergency, just wanted to hear your voice. Call when you can." I hated how formal that sounded. I set the phone face down on the railing and watched the pasture fade into blue-grey bands under low cloud. Midge pressed against my knee once, brief and steady, then went back to watching the dark. Midnight check started mean. Wind knifed through the drawer and stung the skin between my collar and beard. The lower gate had iced at the hinge, so I kicked the post twice and worked it loose with both hands. In pen 3, one ewe had lambed clean and was doing fine. In pen 1, a weak single needed warming, so I tucked him under my coat and walked circles in the aisle while his legs quit trembling. I remember thinking, clear as a bell, this is my whole life now. Circles in the dark, keeping little hearts lit one at a time. It should have broken me more than it did, maybe it already had, and this was just the shape after breaking. By 2 in the morning, I'd finished bottles and stepped back out for another pass along the east fence, same route as noon. My headlamp beam caught the stone wall in slices. Frost rimmed the top rocks, and the grass beside it lay flattened under sleet crust. Midge moved ahead, then slowed, then stopped so sudden I nearly walked into her. She didn't bristle, she didn't growl. She sat, just sat there with her ears soft and eyes fixed on the trees uphill, like she was waiting for somebody to finish a task. "Go on," I whispered. She glanced back at me, stood, took 3 steps, then sat again. I'm not proud of how long I stood arguing with a dog under frozen rain, but it was probably 30 seconds of me insisting this was nonsense, while also listening harder than I had any right to. I heard one branch move up slope, not a crack or a snap, just a slow flex and settle. Too deliberate for wind gust, wrong rhythm for deer, then quiet again. I checked the wall and found a third lamb I hadn't accounted for, a little ewe from the upper group, still damp around the ears but dry underneath where she lay on another bed of cedar. She blinked up at me, annoyed and warm. Beside the boughs sat 2 fist-sized stones crossed over each other, not balanced fancy, just placed. Marker-like, intentional in a plain way that made my skin prickle and then settle. I looked uphill and said, "All right," before I knew I was speaking out loud. Then, because I needed to hear myself be ridiculous enough to stay sane, I added, "I'd started saying thank you to empty timber, which is not how I pictured middle age." The line hung there, and for a second I almost laughed. Midge huffed once like she'd heard worse from me and would not be filing a formal complaint. I lifted the lamb, checked her gums and temp with my fingers, and she was better than she should have been. Not perfect, better. I tucked her inside my coat, one hand supporting her chest, and turned toward the shed. Halfway there, I stopped and looked back. The crossed stones were still by the wall. No movement on the ridge, no drama, just the wind easing and a thin mist sliding low over the swale. Inside, under yellow barn light, everything looked ordinary again. Heat lamps hummed. Ewes shifted weight and sighed. Water bucket, towels, iodine, records. Workbench with a busted latch I kept forgetting to fix. I set the little ewe down with her mother, watched her find a teat, and wrote another notebook line with my knuckles still stinging from cold. Third week lamb found east wall, 2:18 a.m. Dry cedar bedding present. Crossed stones present. Midge behaviour, calm, watchful, no alarm. I stared at that last phrase and underlined no alarm twice. The next day came raw and pale, and I moved through chores slower from lack of sleep. Around noon, when the wind lifted for 10 whole minutes, I walked to the east wall in daylight to test my own memory. The cedar beds were there, flattened now. The stones sat crossed where I'd left them. I checked every gate between house and upper lot. Hand on latch, then pull test. Same as always. Secure. No cut wire. No tyre tracks by the county edge. No boot marks I could separate from mine. I even checked my own cedar stack by the shed and found it short by maybe 8 boughs, though I hadn't cut any in 2 days. That should have made me angry. Instead, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long while, and it took me a minute to name it. Not relief exactly. Curiosity. A small one, careful around the edges, but real enough to interrupt grief for whole stretches of an hour. By the third evening of that pattern, I'd made one change to routine without admitting it was a change. I started leaving the east side easier to access. No loose wire, no tools in the path, and I kept one section of the wall clear of feed sacks and scrap so I could see it from 50 yards. I told myself it was practical visibility for night checks. That was true. It was also not the only reason. After supper, if cold coffee and a heel of bread counted as supper, I stood at the mudroom sink, looking at Lena's label on the milk powder bin, and said into the empty room, "I don't know what I'm looking at. I know that much." I rinsed bottles, dried my hands, and clipped the notebook back into my pocket. Outside, Midge was already at the step waiting, tail low and steady, like we had one more loop to run and maybe one more thing to learn. Midge and I stepped off the mudroom stoop into wind that smelled like wet stone and cedar pitch, and for once, I wasn't walking only to outrun my own head. I checked my flashlight, patted the notebook in my pocket, and headed toward the east wall with that odd mix of caution and interest I usually reserved for a ewe in hard labor. The pasture grass hissed under sleet crust. Somewhere up the ridge, a limb let go of its ice and sprang back with a soft whip sound. When we reached the wall, I found another small bed of cedar set tight against the basalt, dry underneath though the ground around it shone dark with melt. No lamb this time, only the arrangement itself and 3 little stones in a line pointing toward the lower swale, where wind never sat long. I crouched and touched the cut ends. Fresh again. I looked up the slope and felt watched, but not crowded, the way you feel a good hand nearby when you're carrying something heavy down bad steps. I did my full loop and came back through the same spot because I wanted to prove to myself I was still methodical. Gates latched how I left them. Wire intact, no tracks clear enough to swear by. At the shed I checked tags and bellies, then stood a while near pen 2 where a young ewe had twins at dusk. She'd been flighty all week, jumping shadows, pouring straw into ridges like she meant to climb out through the wall. That night, she settled faster than usual. Midge lay down outside the pen and watched the open door, ears loose, breathing slow. I remember noticing my own shoulders had dropped too, and that simple fact bothered me almost as much as it relieved me. Grief had trained me to distrust comfort. If a thing felt better, I assumed I'd missed a problem. Inside my head, the argument started up again in present tense, as clear as if someone had turned on a radio behind my eyes. I told myself this couldn't be real. I told myself somebody was messing with me, and if I had sense, I'd be mad instead of grateful. I told myself I was overworked, underslept, and one missed meal from seeing patterns in fence posts. Then another voice in me, plain and stubborn, kept answering back. The lambs were warmer. The bedding was set with intention. and the dog who trusted no one for free kept sitting down, like she was in church. I stood there with one hand on a gate panel, running that same loop of disbelief and observation, and I knew neither side was winning. What changed was this. For 10 straight minutes while I watched those twins nurse and listened to the soft clink of a chain against the post, I wasn't replaying Caleb's last words. I was paying attention to what was in front of me. Curiosity had edged grief out of the seat, just briefly, and the quiet in my chest felt unfamiliar enough to scare me more than the timber did. By the 4th morning of that pattern, I had begun checking the East Ridge first, before coffee even hit right. Dawn came in layers of pewter and pale blue, with fog down low where the creek bent. I found snare wire from the back fence, the old rusted kind that catches brush and sheep wool if you leave it, coiled neatly on a stump beside the tool path. Not tangled, not kicked aside. Coiled. I carried it back to the barn and set it in the scrap barrel, then wrote the line down because that was what made my day make sense. Snare wire removed from lower run, placed on stump near East Path, 6:27 a.m. Midge watched me write as if she had opinions on my penmanship. I told her, if this turns out to be a neighbor with too much free time, I'm sending him my carving invoices. She blinked slow, which I took as fair criticism of my social strategy. Around noon I had to run to Garrison Feed for milk replacer and mineral blocks. I hated leaving during weather windows, but inventory doesn't care how strange your pasture feels. The store smelled like grain dust and rubber boots and coffee that had sat too long on a burner. Harlan Griggs was at the counter, same as most weekdays, elbows on a stack of order slips, cap pulled low. He was in his late 60s, narrow as a fence rail, eyes that missed nothing even when he pretended to be studying the till. He watched me load sacks and said, "You look like April's using you for target practice." "Wouldn't be the first year," I said. He gave me that half nod old ranchers use when they're deciding whether to risk sounding foolish. My granddad used to talk about spring watchers up your drainage, said they kept to timber, minded lambing grounds, left things better than they found 'em. I laughed at him every time, just thought I'd mention it. I held his look a second longer than polite and said, "If your granddad's watcher can stack straw and fix fencing, I'll put him on payroll." Harlan snorted once. "If you see something kind, Dean, don't ruin it trying to own it." That sat with me all the way home, rattling around the cab with feed sacks and the heater fan. Back at the homestead, the weather tightened again. Sleet came in slant lines that erased distance, then led up just enough to show the ridge before closing over it. I worked through chores, but my attention kept splitting, half on lambing, half on small signs. Near the wall I found another crossed pair of stones, this time angled toward the upper pasture where the ground rose and drained faster. I moved 2 expectant ewes there before dusk. An hour later, wind hit the lower lot hard enough to flatten brush and rattle tin. The upper pair stood dry behind the rise, chewing steady, as if someone had handed me tomorrow's answer this afternoon and waited to see if I'd take it. That evening, Caleb called while I was filling hot water bottles in the mudroom. I nearly missed it because my gloves were wet and the phone slid against the counter. "Hey," he said. "You okay? You texted me at 5:30 saying call when free with 3 periods. That's your emergency punctuation." I leaned against the sink and watched steam bead on the window glass. No emergency. Just tired. "You sound wired, not tired. What's going on?" I looked toward the door where Midge stood, already alert for the next loop. "You ever have a week where things happen you can't square with your own notes?" He was quiet a breath. "Dad, are you sleeping at all?" "Some." "That means no, you're hearing stuff." "Not hearing, seeing. Kind of." I rubbed my forehead, embarrassed even in my own kitchen. Lambs moved out of wind. Cedar beds where I didn't put them. Old wire piled neat. Midge stays calm through all of it. He let out a long breath, not mocking, just careful. Could be somebody helping and not wanting credit. Could be you're doing more than you remember. Either way, please don't run yourself into the ground trying to solve it. Keep the stock warm. Keep you warm. Promise me that much. I can promise that. And eat real food. And eat, not coffee and crusts. I laughed once. You spying through the window now? Don't need to. I was raised by you. When we hung up, I felt the ache of missing him and the steadier warmth of being spoken to plain. I made eggs, actual eggs, and ate them standing at the counter while sleet tapped the pane like fingernails. Dusk dropped early behind cloud, and I took the East Loop on foot instead of the ATV because engines drowned too much. The cold had a metallic taste, and the timberline looked farther off than it was, black trunks against grey. Midge moved ahead, then doubled back, brushing my knee once, then trotted to the wall and sat where she'd sat before. Not stiff, not warning, waiting. I killed my flashlight and let my eyes adjust. For a while I saw only fence posts and brush shapes. Then a section of brush uphill shifted with deliberate care, not the wind-blown sway of branches, but the weight of something choosing each step. At first I thought bear until the form straightened and kept rising. It stood partly screened by young pines, 8, maybe 9 feet, by the way. Its shoulder line sat above a split trunk marker I knew was just over 6. Dark fur, rain dark and matted at the edges, with longer guard hair on the arms catching the last flat light. Broad through the chest, narrow at the waist, built like a creature made for climbing and carrying. But what stopped me from bolting was not size. It was movement. It stepped into an open patch where 2 newborns were huddled near their dam, and instead of striding through, it placed each foot with the patience of a man crossing a room full of sleeping dogs. It angled its body away from the ewe, lowered one arm, and nudged a blown branch aside so it wouldn't scrape the lambs when the wind pushed it. The ewe did not panic. She lifted her head, watched, then returned to licking one lamb's ear. Midge stayed seated, tail laid along the ground, eyes bright and soft. I could hear my own breath, fast and shallow, and the faint click of sleet against basalt. The figure turned just enough that I caught the side of its face. Heavy brow, flat, wide nose, and an eye that flashed amber brown when it caught the dim sky. No bared teeth, no charge, no bluff. It looked at me the way you look at another worker already in the field before dawn, assessing distance and need. Then it shifted back, took 2 careful steps uphill, and paused beside a cedar sapling, one massive hand resting on the trunk as if steadying himself on slick ground. I don't know how long we stayed like that, not frozen in fear, held in attention. I found my voice and kept it low so I wouldn't spook the ewes. I see you. The figure tipped its head once, small and precise, then moved along the ridge, not retreating in haste, simply continuing on a path it had already chosen. Each step was quiet for its size, heel to edge, avoiding loose stones. In 3 breaths it was behind thicker timber, visible in pieces through trunks, then gone into the dark, where the slope folded north. I stood with one hand on the wall until my fingers numbed through the glove. Midge finally rose, stretched, and looked up at me like we still had chores to finish, which we did. I checked the lambs, moved the blown branch farther clear, and walked the rest of the loop with my pulse thudding hard enough to feel in my throat. At the shed, I wrote by lantern light because the power had flickered out again. 7:41 p.m. Visual contact East Ridge. Large bipedal figure, dark fur, estimated 8 to 9 feet. Movement deliberate, non-aggressive. Stepped around ewe/lamb pair carefully. Midge calm, use calm. I stared at non-aggressive for a long second, then added one more line under it, pressing hard enough to tear the paper. Gentle with stock. I capped the pen, set the notebook on the shelf by the iodine, and stood still long enough to hear the weather again. Wind pressed against the barn siding in long, tired gusts. Heat lamps hummed over damp straw. A ewe in pen one gave a low, steady grunt to her twins, that soft mothering sound that means the world is narrowed down to breath and milk and keeping warm. My hands were shaking, not from cold this time, so I wrapped them around the lantern handle and breathed through my nose until my chest stopped fluttering. Then Midge lifted her head toward the open shed door and gave one short exhale, almost a sigh. Not warning, not alarm, a nudge. I picked up the notebook again and added one more line under gentle with stock. No fear response from animal or me after initial shock. I stared at that sentence and nearly crossed out me. It felt too tidy for what was happening inside my ribs. Fear had been there, sure, but it had burned off fast and left something else behind, something wider and quieter that I didn't have a clean word for. "Come on," I said to Midge, and my voice sounded like somebody else's, softer around the edges. We stepped back into sleet and took the same track toward the east wall. I kept my flashlight low and mostly off, using the dim wash from the yard light and what little clouded moon leaked through. The pasture held that iron-grey colour right before full dark, every post and rock turning into silhouette. Halfway to the wall, I stopped and listened. There it was again. Careful movement uphill. Not crashing brush, not hoof scramble. Measured placement, then stillness, then one more measured shift. I spoke before I overthought it. "I'm checking lambs. That's all." No answer came, not in any human way. A branch high on the slope bent and eased back. Midge sat down in the wet grass and looked up at me like we were both waiting for a signal from a foreman neither of us had hired. I moved to the wall and found 2 new cedar boughs laid where wind tunneled through a gap I'd meant to block all week. The stems were angled to catch sleet and shed it away from the hollow behind the stones. Workmanlike. Efficient. Beside them sat another pair of crossed stones, this set closer to the uphill side where runoff stayed shallow. I touched one with my glove and it was dry on the underside, recently placed. I heard my own thoughts go into that old stubborn loop, only this time they changed direction halfway through. I told myself I could still be wrong, still be worn down, still be building a story where there was only weather and luck. I told myself a practical man doesn't hand his judgment over to shadows. Then I looked at the bow angle, the stone placement, the way the yews had drifted into the sheltered pockets without crowding. And I had to admit, a second truth alongside the first. Whatever this was, it was paying attention to the same things I was paying attention to. Wind line, drainage, exposure, new life. That admission settled in me like a tool finding the right drawer after months in the wrong one. By the time I finished that loop and came up by the shed again, sleet had turned finer, and the clouds had lifted just enough to show the upper ridgeline as a dark cutout against lighter sky. I saw him there for 3 full breaths, no trees blocking him this time. Broad shoulders, long arms hanging easy, head turned toward the lower lot where my weakest yews were bedded. He wasn't sneaking. He was standing watch. I froze from habit, waiting for the moment everything would go wrong. It didn't. He shifted his weight, slow, deliberate, then lowered into a crouch beside a downed pine and stayed there, profile open to me. Not closing distance, not retreating, just present. The strangest part was the mutual caution of it. I wasn't hiding from him anymore, and he wasn't hiding from me. I lifted one hand chest high, palm out, same way I'd calm a nervous ram dogged into a corner. "All right," I said. We can do this from a distance." He tipped his head once, that same small, precise gesture from earlier, and rested one massive hand on the log in front of him. Even at that range, I could see how controlled his movement was, how each action had intention and restraint. Size like that should have blundered through brush and broken whatever got in the way. He moved like he didn't want to break anything. Midge stood, wagged her tail one slow sweep, and sat again. I laughed under my breath because there I was in sleet negotiating pasture protocol with an 8-foot neighbor and a blue heeler serving as neutral witness. If Lena could have seen it, she'd have handed me a towel and asked whether I planned to invite him in for coffee or keep conducting diplomacy in freezing rain. When I turned back to the shed, I felt eyes on me, but not in a way that raised my shoulders. More like the sense you get when somebody at your back has picked up the heavy end without announcing it. Inside, chores finished in their usual order. Warm week single in pen 3. Swap wet bedding in 2 corners. Top off hot water bottles. Mark 2 new berths in the notebook. My writing came out cleaner than it had all week. At 11:06 p.m. I wrote. Ridge contact repeated. Subject remained visible at distance. No avoidance behavior when observed. I almost used the word creature, then scratched it out and wrote watcher, because that was closer to the role he seemed to have chosen. The line felt risky and right at the same time. The night rolled on. At 1:20 a.m. the north wind sharpened and brought the next pulse of the April iron freeze, hard enough that sleet rattled on the shed roof like dry seed on tin. I layered my coat, grabbed the tow strap and a coil of rope, and headed for the lower berthing field where the creek bank always failed first. Midge trotted tight at my left knee. Our headlamps, hers imagined, mine real, cut narrow tunnels through blowing grit. At the first bend I saw trouble. A first-time ewe from the red tag group had dropped her lamb too close to the bank, and now she was half down a muddy shelf, front legs scrabbling, hindquarters sinking every time she kicked. The lamb lay 10 feet upslope, soaked and trying to fold itself into a tuft of dead grass. One more hard slide and that ewe would go into the cut where water had undercut the edge. I started down toward her, boot heels searching for traction. "Easy, girl, easy!" A dark shape moved from the willows below me and reached the bank before I did. He came up out of the sleet like part of the hill itself, bigger than he'd looked on the ridge, fur slicked dark and heavy with weather. He didn't glance at me first. He glanced at the ewe, then at the lamb, then at the collapsing edge, reading the same geometry I was reading in half a panic. He planted one foot against exposed root, braced his shoulder into a leaning alder, and extended both arms toward the ewe without touching her face. When she thrashed, he held still. When she paused, he slid one forearm under her chest and lifted just enough to break the suction of mud. It was careful, exact. No wasted movement. "Hold, hold," I heard myself saying, like he needed coaching, which was absurd. I dropped to one knee beside the lamb, tucked it under my coat, and scrambled upslope to firmer ground. "This way," I called, then felt foolish calling directions to someone who had already solved the hardest part. He shifted his grip, angled his body upslope, and gave the ewe a narrow lane between his legs and the bank. She lunged, found purchase, and climbed out in 2 desperate jumps. He never crowded her. He created space and let her choose it. Midge barked once, sharp, excited, not scared, and ran a small circle around the ewe to turn her toward me and the lamb. Good dog. Good, steady dog. The bank gave way where the ewe had been a heartbeat later, a chunk of mud and grass slumping into black water, with a sucking sound that raised the hair on my neck. I looked back at him. He had already stepped to the side and was dragging 2 deadfall limbs into the fresh gap, laying them crosswise to mark and block the edge. not random brush. A barrier visible even in bad light. One branch, then another, then a third set at an angle so stock would drift away from the cut instead of following it in the dark. I carried the lamb to the truck and set it in the lee behind the tailgate while I toweled fast. The ewe pressed in, nosing my elbow, frantic and alive. When I glanced toward the creek again, he was still there, widening that brush barrier with deliberate sweeps of those huge hands, then packing mud against the base with his heel to pin it. Ranch work. Honest and plain. "Thank you," I said, louder this time, not caring how it sounded in wind. He paused, turned enough that I saw one amber-brown eye catch my headlamp, and dipped his chin. Then he picked up a final limb and laid it beside the others, a clean end cap to the line, as if signing his work. I got the ewe and lamb to the shed, dried the little one under heat until its ears warmed, and watched it nurse in jittery, hungry pulls. My hands finally slowed. My breathing did too. I stepped outside once more before dawn, lantern low, and looked toward the ridge. He stood at the tree line for a moment, rain-silvered and still, then raised one hand, not high, just enough to be seen, and turned back into timber. No drama, no demand to be followed, just departure when the urgent work was done. I took the crossed stones from my coat pocket, one from the wall, one from beside the creek barrier, set them on the shed threshold and wrote the final line for that night, with cramped fingers and a steadier heart. 4:52 a.m. Ewe and lamb recovered at Lower Bend. Assistants observed directly. Deliberate, kind, unasked. I set the notebook down on a feed sack and leaned both hands on the edge of the workbench because my knees had gone loose under me. The barn smelled like wet wool, iodine, hot dust from the lamps, and that sweet, sharp milk smell that only happens when a hungry lamb finally latches and settles. The little one from the creek was nursing in short, frantic pulls, tail flicking with each swallow. His dam kept touching him with her nose between gulps, counting him over and over as if she needed proof he was still there. I knew that feeling too well. Midge lay by the aisle gate with her chest against the straw and her eyes half closed. Not asleep, only spent. Every now and then she lifted her head to check the pens, and then lowered it again like she trusted the room to hold for a minute. I wished I trusted anything that easily. I grabbed a dry towel and started rubbing down another damp lamb in pen 2, more out of habit than need, and halfway through the motion I felt something in my chest pull hard and give way. It wasn't dramatic, no shout, no collapse, just a quiet, deep crack where I'd been bracing for 2 years. I sat down on an overturned bucket with the towel still in my hands and bent forward until my forehead touched my knuckles. My breath caught once, then twice. Then I was crying into wool and cotton like a man who had run out of places to store grief. I'd been carrying this idea around since Lena died, though I never said it plain, because saying it plain would have made it real. Kindness had left with her. Duty stayed, chores stayed, bills and weather and hay contracts stayed. But kindness, the unasked kind, the kind that shows up before you know you need it. I figured that had gone in the ground with her, and I was foolish for expecting it again. Sitting there in that yellow light, with lambs alive that should have been lost, with crossed stones on my threshold and cedar beds I never cut, I couldn't keep that story running anymore. I remember thinking in present tense, clear as if someone else was speaking inside my ribs, I am not alone in this field. I am not the last set of careful hands left. I can be wrong about the size of the world and still be a practical man. That thought undid me more than the storm had. I cried until my face hurt and my nose ran and my shoulders shook against my coat. Midge came over and pushed her head against my shin, patient and solid, then sat on my boot so I couldn't move away from what I was feeling. I laughed once through tears and scratched behind her ear. "You and me both, old girl," I said. "We got help and didn't even know how to ask for it." The lamb in my lap bleated at me like I was being unprofessional about all this, which was fair. By first light, the barn roof had stopped rattling and the sleet had softened into dripping eaves. Water ticked from the gutters into mud with that steady plink that means the front has finally spent itself. I stood, wiped my face on my sleeve, and went back to work, because work is still the language I speak best. I checked every pen, counted every lamb, stripped wet bedding, topped warm water, rewired one lamp plug that had started to arc. My hands remembered what to do, even while my head felt new. When I came to the threshold, I picked up the 2 crossed stones I'd set there and turned them over in my palm. Basalt, dark, one smooth and one rough, each with a clean, dry face where it had rested on something protected. I carried them to the mudroom and set them on the shelf beneath Lena's feed tags, between the milk powder bin and the jar of nipple rings. Not hidden, not displayed, kept. Back in the barn aisle, I opened the notebook to a fresh line and wrote a full accounting because if a thing matters, it goes in the record. 5:38 a.m. Storm losses minimal to none at present. Red tag first timer and male lambs stabilized. Creek bank breach temporarily blocked with deadfall barrier. Assistance from unknown watcher repeated and directly observed. Then I paused, listening to the scratch of my own pen, and added one more sentence under it. I have been wrong about what still exists in this world. I didn't cross that line out. The phone buzzed in my chest pocket while I was hanging fresh towels. Caleb's name lit the screen. I let it ring once to clear my throat, then answered. "You up?" he said, and I could hear city traffic far behind him, a low hiss and brake squeal that felt like another planet. "Been up all night?" "You sound—" He hesitated. "You sound different. Did you get hit hard?" I looked down the aisle at 20-some ewes chewing in warm steam, lambs tucked under lamps, Midge standing guard like a little blue statue. We got weather, but we came through it. We? I leaned my shoulder against the post and watched that creek lamb wobble back to his mother, stubborn as a weed through gravel. Me, the dog, and a watcher on the ridge, I guess. He was quiet long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, careful but not mocking, "You still talking about the thing from earlier this week?" "Yeah." Another breath. "Did it scare you?" "No," I said, and felt how true it was. That's the part I can't explain to anybody who wasn't here. It didn't scare me. It helped. He let out a slow breath. "Okay, I don't know what to do with that, Dad, but I hear you." "That's enough. You need anything from town? I can overnight supplies if you're short." I smiled at the wall, at the cracked paint Lena always meant to redo. "Just keep calling sometimes. That's supply enough." "I can do that." When we hung up, the ache was still there, but it had shifted shape. Less like a closed fist, more like an old bruise finally warmed enough to fade at the edges. I walked back outside with the notebook tucked under my arm and stood at the yard where I could see the lower bend. The deadfall barrier at the creek looked exactly as I'd seen him lay it. 3 heavy limbs cross-set, 1 angled brace, mud packed at the base to hold under runoff. No flourish, just competent work done in weather nobody sane would choose. I followed the line with my eyes and nodded without meaning to, the way I used to nod at Lena's fix when she solved something cleaner than I had. The pasture had gone quiet in a different way now. Not empty, settled. Blackbirds were back on the far fence, arguing over nothing. 2 magpies hopped near the hay ring and kept one eye on me like auditors. Midge trotted to the east wall, checked the cedar pocket, and came back at an easy lope. She wasn't scanning for threat anymore. She was checking on a neighbour's completed chore. I took one more full loop before trying for breakfast, because routine matters most when your world cracks open. At the east wall, I found fresh prints in thawing clay above the stone line, wider than a dinner plate and deep at the ball, with a long stride set deliberately around a churned nest of lamb tracks. No overlap, no confusion. He had crossed where footing held, then turned uphill. I photographed them with my phone, then stood there and made a choice. I saved the images in a folder marked lambing records and did not send them to anyone. Some proof is for argument. Some proof is for stewardship. The sun never fully came out that morning, but the cloud lifted enough to show the timber edge in clear layers of green and wet black bark. I watched it a long time from the porch rail where cell service was best, the same post I leaned on when I called Caleb and pretended maybe was enough. I had the strange urge to call Harlan and tell him his granddad had been right. I didn't. He had already told me the only part that mattered. If you see something kind, don't ruin it trying to own it. I kept my phone in my pocket. Near mid-morning, while I was retying a sagging tarp at the north pen, Midge stopped what she was doing and looked towards the upper ridge. Not rigid, just attentive. I followed her gaze and saw him one last time in full daylight, partly screened by lodgepole trunks, tall, dark, rain-dulled fur lifting in the breeze, one hand resting against a tree at shoulder height, to me, and below, shoulder height to him. He stood still long enough for me to understand this was not hiding and not an invitation either. It felt like a simple check-in at shift change. I set the tarp line down and took off my glove so I could raise a bare hand where he could see skin, not just canvas. "Stock's in," I said, voice carrying thin across the wet pasture. "Storm's done." He tipped his head once, same precise motion, same calm. Then he stepped back between two trunks, turned uphill, and moved through timber with that measured, careful gait until the trees took him in pieces, and then completely. No cracked branches after, no crashing retreat, just diminishing presence, and the ordinary sounds of morning folding back into place. Drip from needles, ewe-calls, a raven somewhere beyond the ridge. I waited for another sign, another shape, maybe one amber glance over a shoulder. None came. The line stayed empty. I felt the absence settle, and it did not feel like loss. It felt like the respectful end of a task, done together. I stood there another minute, maybe two, then pulled my glove back on and went to finish tying the tarp. There were bottles to wash, a culvert to clear, and a fence section near the county road that would need resetting before the next blow. The work did not shrink after wonder. It sharpened. I moved through it with a steadier back and a quieter head than I'd had in years. Before I went inside, I opened the notebook one more time and wrote the final line for that morning beneath everything else. 10:12 a.m. Watcher withdrew to timber after weather break. No further approach. Pasture calm. I closed the cover, slipped the pencil in the spiral, and felt something like gratitude settle in the same place grief had camped for too long. I closed the notebook and slipped it back into my chest pocket, then went inside because my hands had started to ache with that deep cold that doesn't leave just because the wind does. In the mudroom, I set the two stones together, crossed the way I'd found them, and looked at Lena's feed tags above them until the room steadied around me. The labels were still practical and bossy and hers. I ran a thumb over the edge of the smoother stone and said, "Quiet. You were right about people helping before they're asked. You just never mentioned it might be this." Midge drank half a bowl of water, then flopped by the door with a grunt like she had worked a double shift and expected no performance review. I laughed, low and tired, and opened the cupboard over the sink where I kept old envelopes and extra batteries. I took out a manila envelope, wrote lambing season notes and images on the front, and slid my phone printouts into it after I ran them on the little printer Lena bought for invoices. The footprint photos were clear enough to start arguments I no longer wanted. I put the envelope in the top drawer of Dad's desk, under vaccination records and land maps. Stored, not displayed. Kept, not used. By the next morning, the yard had gone from crusted sleet to deep churned mud, and the deadfall barrier at the creek was still holding where he had braced it. I brought the post driver down there, set 2 steel T-posts above his limb line, and wired in bright tape so no U would crowd the edge in fog. I left his branches where they were and built my work around them. That felt like the right order of respect. When I finished, I stood with boots sunk to the ankle and looked up at the timber line. Nothing moved. The absence felt companionable, not empty. Around noon, I loaded the rusted snare wire from the scrap barrel into the truck bed and drove it to the metal bin behind Garrison Feed. Harlan was out front wrestling a pallet jack that had one stubborn wheel, and he looked up when I pulled in. He gave me that same measuring glance he always did, then nodded once toward my face. "You look like you slept." "Some," I said. "More than last week." Inside, over coffee that was actually fresh for once, he leaned one elbow on the counter and waited. I could tell he was leaving room for me to say what I came to say. I set my cup down and kept my voice plain. "Your granddad's spring watchers," I said. "Did he ever claim he figured them out?" Harlan shook his head. "No," said naming a thing and understanding a thing weren't the same job. He watched me over the rim of his cup. "You see one?" I held his look. I saw kindness in bad weather. That's what I can swear to. He nodded like a man hearing exactly what he expected and still treating it as important. "Then do what he did. Keep your fences sound. Mind your stock. Don't drag Wonder into town like a trophy fish." "I won't." He tapped the counter twice with one finger. For what it's worth, he also said they showed up around men who were carrying too much alone. That one landed deep. I couldn't answer right away, so I nodded and took my coffee out to the truck before my eyes gave me away in public. That evening, after second check, I called Caleb from the porch post where service came in steady. The sky had cleared to a hard blue-black, and stars were out over the ridge for the first time in days. He picked up quick. "Hey, Dad." "Hey, you got a minute?" "Yeah. You okay?" I watched Midge nose along the porch steps, then settle against the top one. "I owe you an apology first, for that last fight. For what I said about quitting when things got hard. You weren't quitting. You were making a life. I knew that even then, and I said it anyway." The line went quiet. I heard him breathe in, hold it, let it go. "Thank you for saying that. I should have said it 2 years ago." "Maybe," he said, "but I'll take now." I swallowed once and looked out toward the east wall where the stones had first appeared. "I want you here next spring if you can manage it. Not to move back, not as obligation. Just come help me through lambing for a stretch. We'll do it shoulder to shoulder and keep our mouths kinder than last time." He gave a short laugh that sounded like relief. "I can do that. I can take leave in April if I put in early." "Do it." "I will." A pause, softer. "You really are different." "Yeah," I said. "I am." 3 days passed before he called again with dates and bus times, and I wrote them in the same notebook where I'd logged fence staples and bottle feedings. I circled the week in April and underlined Caleb arrives 4:15 p.m. twice, the way a superstitious man might touch wood. That same afternoon, I moved one crossed stone set from the mudroom shelf to the porch rail beside the rain barrel post. Not centered, not decorative, just present where I could see it when I stepped out for night checks. People did what people do. At the co-op, one rancher asked if I'd really cut my lamb losses to near zero during the freeze and gave me a loaded, skeptical smile when I said yes. I told him I got better at windbreaks and creek timing, which was true, and left it there. Another man said he heard I'd been seeing giants, and I shrugged and asked if he wanted my spare mineral block discount before it expired. He laughed, and the conversation turned to hay prices. I stopped trying to win belief. The work did not require it. By the first week of October, I had culvert stones set at the lower bend, fresh woven wire on the east run, and a laminated copy of my April notes in the barn office binder under weather response protocol. I did that because memory softens and paper doesn't. In that same binder, right after feed conversion charts, I added a page titled Storm Placement Cues, lee wall pockets, upper swale drainage, cedar bedding points. Every distinctive sign I'd flagged went on that page. Crossed stones pointing safer ground, animal calm near East Ridge, careful branch clearing around newborns, barrier geometry at creek breach. I did not write a theory. I wrote observations and what actions they suggested. That was my way of honoring mystery without abandoning rigor. Winter ran long that year, but not cruel. When spring rolled back around, Caleb's bus pulled in on a cold grey afternoon that smelled like thawed earth and diesel. I met him at the station in town, and for a second we stood there awkward, as strangers at a fence line. Then he set his duffel down and hugged me hard enough to crack my back. On the drive home, we talked about ordinary things first. Warehouse stories, tire chains, a coffee place he liked near his apartment, because ordinary is where trust rebuilds. That first night of lambing, he took pen 2 and I took pen 3, and we moved around each other like men relearning a dance they used to know by heart. Around midnight, he came into the mudroom carrying empty bottles and stopped at the porch door, staring at the crossed stones on the rail. "You put those there on purpose," he said. "Yeah." He looked at me, not mocking, not afraid. "From that week?" "From that week." He nodded once and set the bottles in the sink. "I don't need the whole explanation tonight." "Good," I said. "I don't have one." Near dawn, we stepped out together to check the east wall. Fog sat low over the swale, and the pasture held that deep, listening quiet right before birds start up. Midge, greyer in the muzzle now but still steady, trotted ahead and then sat facing the ridge with her ears soft. Caleb followed her gaze. At the tree line between 2 lodge poles, a tall, dark shape stood still for one long breath in the misty blue light. Broad shoulders, head slightly inclined toward the lower pens. Watchful, calm. Caleb inhaled sharp and grabbed my sleeve. I put my hand over his without looking away. "It's okay," I said. "Just stand easy." The shape shifted, deliberate as ever, and reached down once, setting something at the edge of the stone wall before stepping back into timber. No rush, no spectacle. When we walked up, we found fresh cedar laid in a dry pocket and 2 stones crossed toward the upper pasture where the wind would turn by evening. Caleb let out a shaky laugh and wiped at his face with the heel of his glove. "I don't know what to call that." "You don't have to call it anything," I said. "You can just do the next right chore." He nodded, and we carried the cedar to where the first new ewe was bedding down. After morning feed, I took the notebook to the porch, opened to a fresh page, and wrote in the same small block letters I'd used for years. April. Season start. Watcher present at East Ridge. Stock calm. Assistance unasked. Again. Caleb witnessed from 40 to 50 yards. Then I closed the cover, set it beside the crossed stones, and looked out over the pasture where lambs wobbled after their mothers in new light. I still didn't understand what I had seen, and I had quit needing to. My life stayed practical: mending wire, drying newborns, timing weather, paying bills. But the framework underneath it changed in one non-trivial and permanent way. I no longer believed grief was the full size of the world. I no longer believed care had to be earned before it arrived. Each spring since, when the wind hardened and the creek started talking rough, I worked my lines with steadier hands. And sometimes at the edge of dawn, I found cedar where I would have put cedar, stones where I needed warning, and tracks turned away from the flock after the danger passed. I kept the porch stones crossed, kept my records straight, kept my arguments to myself, and kept going with gratitude instead of only endurance.